I think we've set up the way in which development has been framed has set up an unnecessary and, in my view, unhelpful dichotomy between the interests of the poor and the interests of the rest, and assuming that one can focus on and complete an agenda of addressing the interests of the poor without, in fact, having a structural transformation agenda of how the entire economy and entire society becomes prosperous. So if you go sector by sector, think of education, think of health, right? A health sector has to address the health needs of the entire population. So I'm much more about a development that is inclusive. But if you think about inclusive development, you have to ask yourself, well, included into what? So the idea that, so one framing of the development problem is that there's somehow a middle class out there that's getting great services and is fully okay, and the only problem is including the poor into the existing functional okay economy or the existing functional okay set of services. That might be a characterization of some very top-end developed countries and maybe some super top-end developing countries. But in the parts of the world I work in, like India, like Indonesia, the middle class is getting very poor services. And so one needs to think, well, we're going to include the poor into what? You can't include the poor into something that doesn't exist. If quality education doesn't exist, you can't include the poor into it. If quality healthcare doesn't exist, you can't include the poor into it. So I think a lot of the low bar development targets have acted as if you can solve the problems of the poor without solving the problems of the middle class, and that the problems of the poor in some sense have to take priority. I think that's an unnecessary and false dichotomy. You need to solve the problems of society and include the poor into those solved problems. So I'm much more about getting a functioning educational system that provides a quality education and including the poor into that, a functional health system that solves the health issues that the society faces and includes the poor into that, rather than imagining that I'm going to separate out the needs of the poor and meet those first or exclusively, which I just don't think works. That's not the way in which the currently contemporaneously well-off economies did it. What they did is they solved the problems of the middle class and included the poor into a functioning system. And we need to get to those functioning systems, which requires structural transformation. So the idea that we can solve the development problem without the structural transformation, I think, is a false dichotomy that's just not worked.